Hey, it's me, Birdie from Show Me Your Mask on TikTok, and I'm here to talk about some updates to do with the U.S. Indian boarding school investigations, as well as the upcoming Supreme Court case that will be heard in November around the Indian Child Welfare Act, otherwise known as ICWA. So, as I've been talking about on my YouTube channel as well as on TikTok, the history of the U.S. Indian boarding schools as well as the Indian Child Welfare Act, they are related because the Indian Child Welfare Act was created because of the government and church treatment of Indigenous children for generations. Um, the investigation into what happened at these Indian boarding schools that were government funded and in many cases church run facilities where the entire goal was to remove the culture from these Indigenous children and assimilate them into society. I'm not going to go too deep into the history. That is something I've covered before, and there is certainly a lot of content that exists here on YouTube already of survivors sharing their stories. I also have extensive resources on my petitions and links pages. I'll link them below for folks to dive a little deeper in on that subject. But as for today, I'm going to be talking about some of the updates around the investigations. Recently, Canada and the United States had Orange Shirt Day, which is September 30th, and it is meant to remember the history and the ongoing effects that the U.S. Indian boarding schools had on the Indigenous populations. And in response to Orange Shirt Day, there have been a few publications releasing their updates on the different institutions that are looking into the history and their involvement. We are seeing some colleges that used to be boarding schools in the past. They are evaluating their archives and looking into their past. If it's Colorado, college in Colorado. Something that I did find interesting, though, was there was a seminar held amongst Catholic clergy. What will come of that remains to be seen, but it is good to see steps being taken to recognize what happened, because up until just this year, even, for the most part, the abuse has been swept under the rug and not acknowledged. But all of that is starting to change. Recently, the Quakers in Alaska made their formal apology to the Alaska Native communities for residential schools and their part in that history. And I came across a website that I will be adding to my petitions and links page. It's called the 74million.org. And I will link them below. They are archivists who are compiling the history of what happened. They're tracking down letters and records for the various schools. So, as I've talked about in previous videos, Interior Department in the United States is conducting the second part to their investigation into this. They released the first part of the report in May, and they are now currently conducting the second part of that investigation. There is legislation that is still making its way through subcommittee, Bill HR 5444, that is it's absolutely necessary that bill get passed. It has to do with addressing multiple issues that face many indigenous communities at large in the United States, and it would mean a lot to get passed. So I will link some petitions to call on your representatives to co-sponsor this bill, and help raise awareness around the Truth in Healing Reconciliation Project that is addressing the history of these boarding schools. So that being said, we're going to transition here into talking about more current day issues, which is Supreme Court challenge that will be taking place in November. So it's Brackeen versus Holland, and it's involving the Indian Child Welfare Act. The challenge is being brought forth by a white couple who is seeking to adopt an Indian child. They already have one sibling, they want to adopt the other. And they seek to deem ICWA is unconstitutional because it's based on race. And while that is an argument, it's also around upholding tribal sovereignty and recognizing the tribal citizenship that child has. It's about keeping the culture alive. When our children get adopted out of our communities, out of our families, and into white families, they are cut off from their culture. And this is something that we have been fighting to prevent the erosion of for generations. And the erosion of our culture was because of the residential schools, the taking of the children and the re-education of them. We are fighting to bring our culture back to our young ones. But if ICWA is overturned in the states that don't have it codified, because there are a handful of states that have ICWA codified into their state constitutions, for all of the other states, then indigenous children are at risk. And the fact that this is happening using lawyers that have a history of representing oil company interests. Gibson Dunn, they represent a lot of different corporations, but they have a very strong relationship with the fossil fuel and oil industry, where they have a history of being on cases involving that challenge tribal sovereignty. Gibson Dunn has chosen to represent the couple that is challenging ICWA pro bono. These are multi-million-dollar lawyers who are choosing to represent this white couple for free. So now that we know who's representing the challenge on ICWA, we have many law groups and law interests who are filing amicus briefs in support of upholding ICWA. So knowing how many different groups have stepped up to support upholding ICWA is reassuring to a degree. Right now, the best thing that we can do is show our support, have public pressure to say that the people want to uphold ICWA, to amplify Indigenous voices, to understand Indigenous history. Because if you don't understand the history, then you don't understand the gravity of what it means when we lose our tribal sovereignty. When we lose having a say over what happens to our children, what happens to our culture, what happens to our land. We are defending our right to continue to exist.